Okay, so you're back for another deep dive. Always a pleasure to have our listeners who like to really get into the nitty-gritty of things, peel back the layers and get to the core of a complex topic. Today we're going to explore what makes teaching truly effective. Not just, good, but exceptional.
Yep.
We're talking about the practices of those champion teachers, the ones who consistently get remarkable results in their classrooms.
And to guide us on this deep dive, we're turning to Doug Lemov's Teach Like a Champion 2.0. Now, what's really striking about Lemov's work is that it's not built on, some airy-fairy theories, but on real on-the-ground observations. He's spent years analyzing what teachers who are actually achieving amazing results are doing day in and day out, and it's all about these very concrete, very specific, and importantly, actionable techniques.
Yeah, techniques you can actually, observe and implement.
Mhm.
And while the book is rooted in a classroom setting, I think the insights we'll uncover today are surprisingly relevant, even if you're not, standing in front of a blackboard.
Mhm.
Because really, anytime you're trying to explain something clearly, to make sure someone truly understands, or you're creating any kind of learning environment that could be leading a team, giving a presentation, or even just having a deep conversation, these techniques can offer a really valuable framework.
Absolutely, because at its core, it's about effective communication and how to create an environment where that can flourish.
So let's get into it. First things first. How do these champion teachers actually know if their students, or in your case, your audience, actually get it? How do they move beyond just assuming understanding?
Right. And Lemov highlights this common trap, relying on what he calls self-report. That's just simply asking, does everyone understand?
Yeah, and we've all been there. You're in a meeting or a workshop, and the presenter throws that out,
Yeah.
and you kind of just nod along even if you're totally lost.
Exactly. It's like, people don't want to look confused, or they might genuinely think they're following along, but they haven't really grasped those key points.
And you're left with this illusion of understanding. It's what the book refers to as a false positive. You think everything's clicking, but it's not.
And that's why it's so critical to be more deliberate and more proactive about assessing understanding.
Okay, so if asking, do you understand, is not the way to go, what do these champion teachers do instead?
Well, Lemov advocates for something called targeted questioning.
And I'm guessing this isn't just about, peppering your students or audience with random questions. There's more to it, right?
Right. It's about carefully planning specific questions to ask at key moments in your lesson or explanation.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting. Lamothe even suggests scripting those questions in advance. Why go to that level of detail?
There's actually a couple of reasons. First, scripting forces you to really think through what it is you're trying to assess. What does a good answer actually look like?
So you're crystal clear on what constitutes genuine understanding, not just surface level agreement.
Exactly. But even more importantly, scripting those questions makes you anticipate those potential points of confusion.
So those common errors or misconceptions that might trip people up?
Exactly. And it forces you to think about how you'll respond to those in a way that actually clarifies and corrects. It's about being proactive in diagnosing and addressing those misunderstandings.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. You're using questions as this precise tool for both gauging and guiding understanding. And it's not just about whether someone gets the answer right, but why they get it right.
Right, exactly.
And the book talks about the reliability and validity of your questions. Can you break that down for us in simple terms?
Sure. So think of reliability as like making sure that an answer isn't just a fluke.
Right. If someone gets it right once, they should be able to get it right consistently.
Exactly. And then validity is all about, making sure that your question is actually measuring what you intend it to measure.
That it's actually getting at the heart of the concept you're trying to assess.
Exactly. So asking why and how questions is crucial for both reliability and validity, because those types of questions require someone to actually demonstrate understanding.
They can't just parrot back a fact or definition.
Right. They have to show they can apply it, explain it, and then similarly, asking the same question in different ways can also give you a much more complete picture.
The book uses an example of the Stamp Act, asking for a definition versus asking, like, what were the causes of the Stamp Act?
Right. And each format probes a different facet of their understanding.
Okay, so moving beyond just asking questions verbally, what other techniques does the book highlight for getting a clearer sense of understanding?
Another technique that is really effective is standardize the format.
Which might sound, pretty basic, but it actually has some surprising benefits.
Right. And Lemov gives this example of a training where everyone was working on the same numbered problems, but they were on a worksheet.
So everyone was tackling the same tasks in the same format.
Exactly. And because of that, the facilitator could just glance around the room and immediately see where people were getting stuck.
So it's about structuring how people present their understanding to make it easier to spot those patterns.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And then, along similar lines, he also talks about standardize the visual field. Like, think about a really complicated diagram or a process with a million steps.
It's so much harder to see where the breakdowns in understanding are happening than if the information is laid out really clearly and consistently.
Right. So standardizing the format, whether it's the tasks or the visual presentation, can actually reveal a lot of data about understanding.
Yeah, that makes me think of, troubleshooting a technical problem. It's so much
Mhm.
easier when you have a clear schematic to work with, as opposed to when everything's just all jumbled up.
Absolutely. It's all about creating that clarity so that the data can emerge.
Okay, and then there's this idea of tracking, not watching. Can you explain the distinction there?
Yeah. So, watching can be pretty passive. You're just kind of generally observing, taking it all in.
You're present, but not necessarily focused on specific things.
Right. But tracking is intentional. It's deciding in advance what particular indicators of understanding or misunderstanding you're going to focus on. So it's like, you're actively looking for specific things in their work.
Like how they're applying a specific concept or how they're using evidence to support an argument.
Exactly. And the book contrasts teachers who are making these really broad observations about students with those who are tracking, like how many times a student uses a particular strategy or how often they make a specific type of error.
It's almost like putting on a specific set of glasses that filter out the noise and help you hone in on the signal.
Right, exactly.
Okay, now what about getting a quick read on the understanding of a whole group at once? Limavov talks about show me techniques.
Right. Show Me is fantastic for that. It lets you gather objective data from everyone simultaneously.
So instead of relying on like just a few vocal students or those who raise their hands.
Exactly. So this might be, something as simple as using hand signals to quickly gauge agreement or understanding, or using those little whiteboards, sometimes called slates, where everyone can write down their answer to a quick question and then hold it up all at the same time.
It's like taking an instant snapshot of the whole group's understanding.
Exactly.
Okay, and the last technique in this section on gathering data is affirmative checking. How does that work?
So affirmative checking is basically building in these specific points where individuals have to actively verify their understanding before moving on to more independent work.
Kind of like checkpoints along the way.
Exactly. So, one teacher in the book, Bob Zimmerly, uses checkpoints after every couple of problems. And another, Hillary Lewis, uses a ticket system where, a student has to answer a question correctly to get a ticket to move on to the next activity.
So it's ensuring a certain level of mastery before moving on to more complex tasks.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about all these ways to gather data on understanding, but what happens next? How do you actually act on that data?
That's where the rubber meets the road. It's great to have all that information, but it's really about what you do with it. And Lemov highlights this psychological hurdle we often face. We gather the data, but then there's this natural tendency to kind of brush over the errors or the misunderstandings. Just want to keep things moving.
It can be uncomfortable, right, to dwell on those mistakes. Easier to just pretend they're not there.
Exactly. And he calls this burying the data. But the reality is, you're not actually helping anyone learn if you're ignoring the evidence of what they're not getting.
It's about facing that data head on,
Yeah.
as uncomfortable as it might be.
Right. And part of overcoming that involves building what Limov calls a culture of error.
Now, a culture of error might sound a little strange at first.
It does, but the idea is actually really powerful. A culture of error is one where mistakes are seen as valuable opportunities for learning and growth.
Not as failures or something to be ashamed of.
Exactly. It's like, if someone makes a mistake, it's not a big deal. It's an opportunity to dig in, figure out what went wrong, and learn from it.
And he gives this great example of a teacher, Katie McNichol, whose students felt so comfortable with this idea of error that they would actually nominate problems from their homework to go over in class, the ones they'd struggled with.
Right. It was this environment where error was expected, and it was okay to not get it right the first time.
And that psychological safety is so key, isn't it, to
Yeah.
creating a space where people feel comfortable taking risks and admitting when they're struggling.
Absolutely. And it allows you, as the teacher or the explainer, to actually address those misunderstandings effectively. Because if people are afraid to reveal what they don't know, you can't help them.
So how do you actually foster that kind of culture? The book talks about expect error. What does that look like in practice?
Expect error is all about communicating to people that making mistakes is a natural and even necessary part of the learning process.
It's about normalizing error.
Exactly. And he gives this great example from another teacher, Bob Zimmerly, who has this amazing way of responding to mistakes. He says things like, I'm so glad you made that mistake. It's going to help me help you.
It's like instead of getting frustrated or making the student feel bad, he's framing it as a positive, a learning opportunity.
Exactly. And that simple shift in language can make a huge difference in how people perceive and react to mistakes.
It reminds me of, how we often hear in the business world about the importance of failing fast
Yeah.
and learning from those failures. It's a very similar mindset.
Right. It's about embracing those moments of productive failure.
Okay, now what about when an error does happen? Instead of just jumping in and giving the right answer, the book talks about this idea of excavate error.
Right. An excavator is all about guiding people towards the correct understanding instead of just handing them the answer.
It's about making them do the cognitive work to get to that answer themselves.
Exactly. And it involves things like, withholding the answer even when you're dealing with a multiple choice question and being really careful about your nonverbal cues. Like you don't want to accidentally give away the answer with your facial expressions or body language.
Right. You don't want to have a tell that tips them off.
Exactly. And Lamov gives this great example of a teacher, Jason Armstrong, who puts multiple answers, both right and wrong, on the board and then has a discussion about each one.
So he's making the students actively engage with the error and the reasoning behind the correct answer.
Exactly. And by doing that, they're much more likely to internalize that understanding and remember it.
Because they've really wrestled with the concept themselves.
Right. Now, it's worth noting that Lamov also cautions against going too far with this. You don't want to overanalyze errors to the point where it becomes, demoralizing or just bogged down in the weeds.
Right. It's about finding that balance between digging into the error and keeping things moving.
Exactly. And that's where the next technique, own and track, comes in.
And that's all about students correcting or revising their own work.
Right. But research suggests that, for some students, especially those who are already struggling, focusing too much on what's wrong can actually be kind of counterproductive.
It can make them feel discouraged or like they're not capable of getting it right.
Exactly. So Lamov suggests this more constructive approach. Label the errors really clearly and concisely, and then ask them to revise based on that feedback.
So instead of just saying, this is wrong, you
Yeah.
might say something like, this needs more supporting evidence, or this argument isn't fully developed.
Right. It keeps the focus on improvement and on developing those skills rather than just dwelling on the mistake itself.
Okay, so we've talked about checking for understanding and how to act on those errors. Now, I want to talk about the foundation that all of this rests on, which is what Lamov calls academic ethos. What does that mean in the context of, someone who might not be in a traditional academic setting?
So academic ethos is really about setting a high bar. It's about creating an environment where rigorous engagement with the material is the norm and it's valued.
So it's not just about, showing up and going through the motions. It's about really grappling with the ideas.
Exactly. And it's about conveying this belief that everyone is capable of reaching that high bar, even if it's challenging.
So it's this underlying expectation of excellence,
Right. And one of the key techniques for building this ethos is no opt-out.
which sounds pretty firm.
It is. No opt-out means ensuring that when someone says, I don't know, or tries to disengage, the interaction doesn't end there.
It's about holding everyone accountable for participating in the learning process.
Right. The goal is to guide them to a point of success, even if it means providing a hint or even giving them the answer and then having them articulate it back to you.
So it's about making sure that everyone is actively engaged and that they have the opportunity to to practice getting it right.
Exactly. And it reinforces this idea that that everyone's voice matters and that everyone is capable of contributing.
Now, following on that is
Yeah.
right,
Or
is right. So it's not enough to just get the general idea.
yeah.
The answer needs to be completely accurate, doesn't it?
Right, right. It
Yeah.
emphasizes the importance of insisting on that full accuracy. But it's not about being, harsh or punitive. It's about communicating this belief in their ability to get there.
So it's about holding that high standard while also being supportive and encouraging.
Exactly. And Lemov suggests, having some go-to phrases ready to gently nudge them towards a more precise or complete answer while still being, positive and encouraging.
So it's like, you're not letting them settle for good enough because you know they're capable of more.
Right. And then, for those who do get the right answer, the learning doesn't stop there.
That's where Stretch It comes in.
Exactly. Stretch It is all about asking follow-up questions to those successful answers to really deepen understanding.
So it could be, asking for more detail, asking them to explain why, making connections to other concepts.
Right. Or even asking them to apply the idea in a new context.
And Lumov quotes a teacher named John Burmeister who says that the reward for right answers is harder questions.
I love that. Yeah, it's a great way to put it because it creates this culture where challenge is seen as a positive thing. And Lemov also talks about prompting as a kind of less directive way to stretch understanding. So, instead of asking a specific follow-up question, you might just say something like, tell me more about that, or can you give me an example?
So it's about inviting them to elaborate and go deeper without necessarily leading them in a specific direction. Now, something that might seem a little less directly related to academics, but that the book emphasizes, is format matters. Why is that important in a more general communication context?
So format matters is all about the importance of clear and structured communication. And in the classroom, that often means things like complete sentences and proper grammar.
It's about teaching those fundamental building blocks of effective expression.
Right. But more broadly, it's about making sure that the way you present information, whether it's written or spoken, is clear, organized, and adheres to those appropriate conventions.
It's like, if you're writing an email or giving a presentation, you want to make sure it's formatted in a way that's easy to follow and understand.
Exactly. And it's not just about aesthetics, It's really about ensuring that your message is communicated clearly and effectively.
Because that clarity of format really underpins effective communication.
It does.
And finally, in this section on academic ethos, there's this idea of without apology. And I think this addresses this tendency we sometimes have, especially when we're presenting challenging material, to kind of apologize for it.
Right. Without apology is about embracing that rigorous content and those high expectations without watering things down or making excuses for the difficulty.
It's about conveying this belief that, this material is important and that your audience is capable of handling it.
Exactly. And Lemov gives these examples of teachers who inspired their students with really demanding material and schools that successfully taught, complex subjects to students who others had written off.
It's about defying those low expectations and believing in the power of rigorous learning.
Right. And he also briefly mentions a couple of other supporting techniques, like begin with the end, which is all about having clear learning objectives, and draw the map, which is about thoughtfully using your physical space to support learning.
Okay, so we've talked about checking for understanding, acting on those errors, and building this strong foundation of high expectations. Now, how do you keep people engaged throughout all of this?
That's where pacing and activities come in. And, pacing, as Lemov defines it, isn't just about how fast you're going.
It's about the audience's perception of momentum and progress.
Exactly. It's about how the learning experience feels to them.
So you want to keep them feeling like they're moving forward and making progress, even when the material is challenging.
Right. And one of the ways to manage that perception is to change the pace.
So it's about varying the types of activities and the format of the learning experience to keep things fresh and engaging.
Exactly. So, instead of just lecturing for an hour, you might switch to a group discussion or a hands-on activity.
Or you might have them work independently for a while and then come back together for a whole group debrief.
Right. And these shifts in format and activity can really help to re-energize people and keep them focused, even when you're dealing with, complex or lengthy material.
And it's not just about changing the activities themselves, but also about making those transitions between activities smooth and clear.
Right.
And that's what Limov calls brighten lines.
Brighten lines is all about signaling those transitions really clearly. So, instead of just abruptly shifting from one thing to the next, you might summarize what you just covered, give people a moment to process, and then explicitly say, okay, now we're going to move on to.
It's like providing those signposts along the way to
Yeah,
help people stay oriented.
exactly. And it prevents that feeling of being lost or confused when the focus suddenly shifts.
Another aspect of pacing that I found really interesting is manage the pause. So this is about using silence strategically, isn't it?
It is, and it's something that a lot of people, especially those who are new to teaching or presenting, struggle with.
Because we're so conditioned to fill every silence, to keep talking.
Right. But those moments of silence can actually be really powerful.
They give people time to think, to process, to formulate their responses.
Exactly. And they can also help to create a sense of anticipation or to emphasize a particular point.
So it's about being intentional with those pauses, not just letting them happen accidentally.
Right. And Lemov also mentions a couple of other techniques for managing pacing, like having some back pocket activities ready to go if you find yourself with some unexpected downtime.
So you're always prepared to keep things moving and keep people engaged.
Right. And he also talks about using look forward statements to build anticipation for what's coming next.
Kind of like giving them a sneak peek of what they're going to learn.
Exactly.
Okay, now a concept that seems to run through a lot of these techniques is ratio.
Right.
Can you explain what that means in this context?
So ratio is all about the balance of participation.
And more importantly, the level of thinking that the audience is doing versus how much you, as the teacher or presenter, are doing.
Exactly. The goal is to maximize the amount of thinking that your audience is doing.
So it's about shifting that balance away from you as the sage on the stage and towards them as the active learners.
Right. And he mentions this idea of the content prerequisite, which is basically this understanding that, you can't have a high level of deep thinking and engagement if people don't have the basic knowledge and understanding of the topic.
So you have to make sure that that foundation is there before you can really start building on it.
Exactly.
Okay, and one technique that's specifically aimed at increasing this think ratio is wait time. Can you explain that one?
Yeah. So wait time is simply pausing for a few seconds after asking a question before you expect an answer.
And it sounds so simple, but it can actually be really powerful.
It can. It gives people that time to process the question, formulate their thoughts, come up with a more considered response.
And it also encourages more people to participate because it's not just a race to see who can shout out the answer first.
Right. It creates this space for more thoughtful engagement.
Okay. And another technique for engaging everyone, regardless of who volunteers, is cold call.
Right. And cold call sometimes gets a bad rap because people think of it as, putting students on the spot.
Like that classic scene in a movie where the teacher picks on the kid who's not paying attention.
Right. But when done well, cold call is actually a really effective way to keep everyone engaged and accountable.
Because they know that, they could be called on at any time.
Exactly. And Limov outlines several benefits of using cold call. It keeps everyone on their toes mentally. It gives you, as the teacher, data on the understanding of a wider range of students, not just the ones who are always raising their hands. It distributes participation more evenly. And importantly, it communicates this belief that that everyone is capable of contributing.
So it's not about catching people out or making them feel uncomfortable. It's about creating this culture of shared responsibility and active engagement.
Exactly.
Okay. And another technique for promoting active participation that we see used a lot, not just in classrooms, but in other settings too, is call and response.
Call and response is a great way to build energy and get everyone involved.
So, you provide a prompt and the audience responds, often in unison.
Right. And it can be used for everything from, simple repetition of key facts to more complex applications of ideas.
There's something really powerful about that collective response, about everyone contributing together.
It creates this sense of shared purpose and momentum.
Now, what about when someone's struggling with a question? Limov talks about break it down as a way to help them without just giving them the answer.
Right. And this is such a crucial skill, whether you're a teacher or a manager or just someone who's trying to explain a complex idea to a friend or colleague.
Because it can be so tempting to just, jump in and give them the answer.
It can, but break it down is all about providing those targeted hints or scaffolding the question in a way that helps them access their own understanding.
So you're kind of you're guiding them towards the solution without actually giving it to them.
Exactly. And the goal is to give them just enough support to help them figure it out themselves.
So you're not doing the cognitive work for them, but you're giving them the tools they need to do it themselves.
Right. And Lemma emphasizes the importance of circling back to the broader concept after you've broken down the question to make sure they understand how it all fits together.
So they're not just getting the answer to that one specific question. They're understanding the bigger picture.
Right.
And finally, in this section on techniques for engagement and participation, Lemov talks about Pepper.
Pepper is a really fun technique for quick review and for injecting a bit of energy into the learning experience.
So it's a fast-paced activity where you're asking a series of quick questions, often directed at different individuals in quick succession.
Exactly. And it's great for reinforcing those basic facts and concepts. And it can also be used as a warm-up or a way to change the energy in the room.
It's like a mental workout.
Right.
Okay, so we've covered techniques for engagement and participation. Now let's talk about how you can help people develop deeper thinking and express their ideas more effectively. And, this next section, which is titled Developing Student Expression and Deeper Thinking, might sound like it's only relevant to, students in a classroom. But I actually think these techniques are really valuable for anyone who's trying to articulate complex ideas clearly and persuasively.
I agree. It's all about honing those communication skills.
So at the foundation of this is the art of the sentence.
The art of the sentence is really about teaching people how to synthesize complex ideas into these single, well-crafted sentences.
So it's about being concise, precise, and really deliberate with your language.
Exactly. And the book talks about using sentence starters and specific parameters to help people construct those more sophisticated sentences.
So it's like, you might give them a prompt that starts with, although, or despite the fact that, to encourage them to think about those contrasting ideas.
Right. It helps them to frame their thinking in a more nuanced and sophisticated way.
Okay, and then building on that is show call.
Show call is a great way to analyze and learn from examples. So, you might share a student's written response or a solution to a problem or even just a really insightful comment that someone made, and you use that as a springboard for discussion.
So it's about showcasing those exemplars and having the group discuss what makes them effective or how they could be improved.
Exactly. And it's really important to get the person's permission before you share their work, to create that safe and supportive environment.
Right. You want them to feel comfortable and proud to have their work shared. Now, to develop the ability to sustain that focused thinking and that clear articulation over time, Lemov talks about build stamina.
Right. And this is particularly important for writing, which can be such a challenging task for a lot of people.
Because it requires that sustained focus and effort.
It does. And build stamina is all about gradually increasing the amount of time that people are expected to engage in that focus work so that they can build up their endurance.
So, you might start with shorter writing assignments and then gradually increase the length and complexity over time.
Right. And it's important to provide support along the way, to help people overcome those challenges and build their confidence.
And then to encourage deeper individual thought before you jump into a group discussion, Lemov suggests front the writing.
Right. So front the writing is basically having people write about their ideas before you have a discussion about them.
So instead of just, jumping right into the discussion, they have that time to process their thoughts individually first.
Exactly. And it can lead to much richer and more thoughtful discussions because people come prepared with their ideas already formed.
Okay, now, for the discussions themselves, Lemov emphasizes the importance of establishing good habits of discussion. So it's about setting those ground rules for productive and respectful conversation.
Right. And he outlined several key components of this, things like making sure that everyone can be heard, using each other's names, actively listening to each other's ideas,